for chapter 7, we have classical Persia, our first introduction to the classical period. Before we get started, probably be a good idea to have a copy of your PowerPoint in front of you. I encourage you, as I emphasize key points, as I point out certain things, that you highlight, underline, star, just make reference in your PowerPoints. And always a good idea as I expand on certain topics to be adding stuff in the margins of your notes and to be noting questions in any spot that you may be unfamiliar with, so that we can cover those in class. First things first, chapter 7, Empire of Persia, as I said before, somewhere in here probably be a good idea to add classical period 500 BCE all the way to 500 CE. And to get started here, let's just take a look at Persia. What you see in purple here on this map of the region is the Achaemenid Empire. And the Achaemenid Empire was the first of the 4 Persian empires that we are introduced to in this chapter. As you can see, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, encompassed prime real estate of the time period. Everything from the Ionian Peninsula over here, Anatolia, Palestine, Phoenicia in the eastern Mediterranean basin, Nile River Valley, access obviously again here to the Mediterranean. All of what we just covered in Mesopotamia with the Tigris and the Euphrates, and then traveling even further east into modern-day Iran and taking its border all the way to the Indus River. As you can see, a very large empire, and in turn going to encompass quite a few different groups of people. So it will be a challenge that the Achaemenid empires will have to deal with in time. Next slide here, we have the 4 empires that are covered during this time period in the region. I think a good way to kind of go about thinking about these 4 empires is that the Achaemenids are the first and maybe the most prevalent. They're the ones that really kind of got the region going, got the ball rolling, and that's where some of the most significant leaders will come from as well. The bulk of the information that you need to be familiar with comes from the Achaemenid Empire, and actually many of the things that we cover here will kind of fall into place here. Some key events that kind of lead to transitions. The Achaemenids will actually fall to Alexander of Macedon. You may know him a little better as Alexander the Great. In the 300s BCE goes on his conquests, and the Achaemenids collapse. Unfortunately, after Alexander created his empire, he does die and divides his empire into 3. The one that's relevant to Persia, though, is the Seleucid Empire, named after one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus. The Seleucid Empire will replace the Achaemenid, and then kind of slowly but surely, as the Seleucids started to collapse, the Parthian Empire very smallly started to grow, eventually eclipsing the Seleucid. So these 2 empires, as you can see by the date range, were more or less around at the same time period and were neighbors of each other. Seleucid starts big, Parthian starts small. As the Parthian continues to grow, the Seleucid continues to get smaller. And when the Parthian collapses in 224 CE, it's replaced with the Sassanid Empire, which will take us all the way to the end of the classical period and lead to the beginning of the post-classical period, and will be toppled eventually by the Muslim attackers, Muslim warriors, excuse me, with the Umayyad dynasty, and then later on you'll have the Abbasid Caliphate, the first 2 Islamic empires that the world sees. So let's talk details of the individual empires now. We'll start with the Achaemenid Empire. The first 3 bullet points are really just kind of how the individuals that made up the ruling class of the Achaemenid Empire came to be. If you think back to our discussions in chapter 4 of India, we talked about the Indo-Europeans and the Aryans. Well, the Medes and the Persians, as you see up here at the top, were really kind of descendants of the same group of people. They were pastoral nomads that were kind of living on the steppes outside of the early Mesopotamian civilizations. And during the foundations period, as the Mesopotamian empires collapsed, right, Assyrian Empire, your new Babylonian Empire fell into decline, these pastoral nomads, who happened to be very violent people, very good warriors, excellent equestrian skills, excellent bow skills, entered into the region and subsequently started building an empire. And the individual kind of behind this movement was Cyrus. And Cyrus is one of the three super important rulers that you need to know from the Achaemenid Empire. And each of those three, we give a little nickname to help us better understand who they are and what they're all about. So Cyrus the Achaemenid, or Cyrus the Shepherd, another nickname kind of given to him based on where he was from, was known as the Conqueror. And that's the most significant feature of Cyrus, is that he was the one who built the Achaemenid Empire. You see a few other details in here on Cyrus, but more or less he's the one that pieced the Persians together originally, united all of their nomadic tribes, created a unified army, went out and conquered and built the Achaemenid Empire. By 548 BCE, right in the middle of his reign, all of Iran, modern-day Iran, is under his control, and the Achaemenid Empire is well on its way into growing into one of the largest empires that the world's seen at the time. Following Cyrus's death, his son takes over and kind of expands the empire a little bit more. And the next significant ruler that we need to know well is Darius. And the nickname that we'll associate with Darius is that he was an administrator. Quite different from his grandpa Cyrus, the conqueror. So rather than putting on his military garb, going out and pounding his chest and beating up on people, Darius sat behind a desk and did that type of work. But that was what the time called for. Under Darius's leadership, and when he took office and when he became leader of the Achaemenids, he inherited a huge empire. Remember the map that we just talked about? Obviously people living here are so different from people living here, so different from people living here. 35 million people, super diverse, 70 different ethnic groups, probably even more language and dialects. How do you govern all of these people and keep all of these people on the same page? A very difficult task that was left to Darius, granted while he spent his time as an administrator behind the desk trying to keep people happy. Probably a good idea to highlight Persepolis. This was his capital. Obviously built it to house his bureaucracy, but even more so he wanted to be a symbol of the Achaemenid strength and power, so that the outside world would recognize it. The next slide that you see here, excuse me, one too far. The next slide that you see here, these three different bullet points are various characteristics of Darius's government. These are his administrative policies that he put into place that really allowed the Achaemenid Empire to thrive. First, let's just talk about his political system. So you got this huge empire, all sorts of different people. How do we keep it in order? So we divided into 23 satrapies. A new term, it's a little confusing, especially when we start talking about satraps. But a satrapy is simply a state. It's a region, it's a place, it's a location. An administrative district, call it. So within the Achaemenid Empire, he created 23 different satrapies that were each governed or controlled by an individual satrap. And a satrap is just a name for a leader or a governor. So safe to say you have Darius at the top, and then you have 23 different individuals that are reporting to Darius that are kind of maintaining order in each of the individual satrapies. And the Achaemenid was kind of a fusion of centralized and decentralized rule. He certainly handed them a codification of laws and a tax structure that had to be implemented. But really, he kind of left the minor duties to the individual satrap to implement that met the needs of the people in their state. By this way, people buy into the greater good of the Achaemenid, yet they still feel the autonomy to make some of their own decisions, and they know that their world aren't going to be turned upside down because they're controlled by an outside force. And then two components of his political system that kept these satraps in check, because the main worry is that one of these gains too much power, in turn they could come back and give Darius a run for his money. So one is that he had a bunch of government bureaucrats. So a bunch of people working for the satraps that technically reported back to Darius, and they did all the dirty work of going out to homes, collecting taxes, and monitoring stuff, enforcing law, things of that nature. But more importantly, you had spies. And you never knew when these guys were going to be around. And in the Achaemenid, they were referred to as the eyes and ears of the king. So you always had to be on your toes. You never quite knew when someone was going to show up and be checking your books. It could happen on a Tuesday morning, a Wednesday night. Someone would walk in and say, hey, I'm auditing this, I need to look at this. And of course, if you were up to no good, the punishment was simple. It was death. And you were obviously deathly afraid of death. Kept the satraps in check. If the satraps in check, the satrapies run efficiently, and the whole system tends to flow. In terms of taxes, just to make life a little bit easier, Darius standardized coins. Obviously, he said this is how much you owe. You didn't have one person paying you in wheat, then another person paying you in corn, and another person paying you in sheep, and another person paying you in goats. You owe me this much silver at the end of every year. Let's make it simple. There's no questions asked. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there was a standard codification of laws that everyone across the empire had to follow. To enhance communication and travel, they built the Persian Royal Road. If I come back to the map, the Persian Royal Road, you can roughly kind of see here, going to run all the way from Anatolia all the way down into Susa, and then into the capital of Persepolis that you see down here. And the Royal Road was great because it will facilitate trade. It will be a place where merchants can travel. It's safe. You don't have to worry about being mugged or robbed. And it also made news travel that much quicker. I think there was something like 111 different postal stations that were all connected by a courier network. Kind of like an ancient UPS or FedEx service. And basically from all of these postal stations along the road, you'd have a horse sprint from one to the next, and then a courier would hop on another horse to carry the letter the next way, so the horses were always sprinting from postal station to postal station to postal station. So rather than finding out about something 2 weeks later, which is way too late to act, you could hear about something that's going on in a far spot of the empire a day or two later, which gave you ample time to obviously get things in order and keep people in check. Cyrus conqueror, Darius the administrator. Let's talk real quick about the third individual. The third significant individual is Xerxes that we need to know. And the nickname, super original, that we use for Xerxes is the guy or the dude who screwed everything up. Cyrus, great job, built this huge empire. Darius, great job. He found out a way to keep this huge empire in check and to get people to buy into it. And then there's Xerxes, the individual that just made the empire fall apart. Whereas Darius was super tolerant of other individuals, where he was supportive of other people's viewpoints, religions, cultures, Xerxes came in kind of like a bull in a china shop. He said, this is how you're going to act. This is what you're going to do. I could care less about how you lived in the past. I could care less about your traditional cultures. You're going to live like me. And obviously, none of us in this world like to be told what to do, forced into a certain way. So needless to say, revolts almost ensued immediately when he came in with these new policies. Add the Persian Wars, which we'll actually talk about in a little bit more detail when we discuss the Greeks in chapter 10. Add the Persian Wars to the frustration of the populace, and Xerxes really just kind of leads the Achaemenid Empire into the ground. The one part of the Persian Wars that you need to be familiar with is that Xerxes was fascinated with conquering Greece. Cyrus had a legacy, Darius had a legacy. What's going to be Xerxes' legacy? Xerxes wanted to be the guy that could finally conquer Greece because Cyrus couldn't do it, Darius couldn't do it. This is going to be the way that history books remember me. Doesn't learn from the past, neglects to learn from his predecessors, and by attempting to overrun the Greeks. He wasted so much money and lost so much respect on behalf of his people that the empire was pretty much done when the invasions failed. The Achaemenid is well into decline by 465 BCE. Over the next 100 years or so, it's barely just hanging on by a shoestring. Enter Alexander the Great, and it's a game, set, match for this empire. A couple quick thoughts here on Alexander the Great. Again, we'll talk about him in a little bit more detail when we get to chapter 10. But he came from Macedon and first invades Greece. His dad actually invaded Greece, and then when he actually takes over after his dad's assassinated, his dad's vision was always to conquer the Achaemenids, and Alexander in turn carries out his dad's vision. He comes in with a smaller army, yet they were better equipped with better weapons, they had better tactics. An Achaemenid in decline was simply no match for Alexander and his Macedonian troops. By 334 BCE, they burned Persepolis to the ground. The Achaemenid is over. For a very short period, Alexander gets to enjoy the fruits of his conquest. But then he dies at the young age of, I want to say, like 33, and his empire that he created was actually divided into three. If you take a look at this map here, you see the conquests of Alexander. Starts all the way up here in Macedonia, right, and then kind of comes in through here in Anatolia, down into Egypt, right, and then back into Persia, into Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. Eventually will make his way over to the Indus River, encompassing everything that we looked at in the previous map of the Achaemenid Empire, and then comes back, and actually at Susa is where Alexander dies. And then the maps that you see here are actually the three empires that were created after the death of Alexander. The thing is that they couldn't figure out how to divide up all the land that he had conquered. So his three generals kind of said, you take this, you take that, and I'll take this. The two kind of insignificant ones right now, because we're not focused on that region, are one, the Ptolemaic Empire, which was here in Egypt. The second is the Antigonid Empire, which is over here in Greece and Macedonia. But the one that we need to be familiar with is the Seleucid Empire, which more or less encompassed virtually everything that the Achaemenid was here in the Middle East and extending into the Indus River Valley. I'll just fast forward back to the previous slide. When we say Alexander's empire was divided into three, here are the three different spots with the various locations. Another map here. Here you see the Achaemenid Empire in the darker orange, compared to the Seleucid Empire. You see kind of in the diagonal white. Not nearly as big, right? I mean, it was divided up. We lost Egypt. Granted, Greece, Macedonia, never a part of it, so that's not really too significant. But more or less encompassing modern-day Iran and the modern-day Middle East as well. Basic thoughts on the Seleucid Empire. Won't talk about these in a ton of detail, but read over them. I think the most important thing to note is here, and you'll see this with the Parthians, and you'll see this with the Sassanids as well. Those essential political structures, those basic ways of organizing public life are carried out over the ages. The Achaemenids under Darius created something amazing, and the Seleucids will continue to carry out the same policies. So a continuity we see from empire to empire. Granted, we got different people in control, but the same stuff and the same things are still being practiced. And as I said at the beginning of our talk, the Seleucid starts out as this fairly large empire. And then, if I just jump back to the map, slowly but surely what we're going to see is the Parthian Empire start to kind of creep in on the Seleucid. Right? And as the Parthian continues to grow a bit, the Seleucid is going to push its borders, and eventually be eclipsed by one, the Parthians, and two, the Romans. Here's some basic thoughts again on the Parthians. Not going to go over them individually, but here's that same bullet point as I just pointed out in the slide on the Seleucids. You see those Achaemenid administrative techniques coming out again. After the Parthians do eclipse, the Seleucid and the Seleucids are gone. The Parthians will, for a very short time, be ruling on their own, eventually falling victim, one, to the Romans, kind of in the western portions of their region, and then later on to the Sassanids in the eastern portion of their region. And then we finish our talk here with just a couple quick thoughts on the Sassanids. Again, focusing on those Achaemenid administrative techniques, satraps, satrapies, eyes and ears of the king, standardization of coins, standardization of laws. And the Sassanids will take us all the way to the end, even kind of pushing the time period a little bit, all the way to the end of the classical period. And finally, it is those early Islamic warriors that lead to the demise of the Sassanid. It'll usher in one, obviously, a new empire, that of the Umayyad dynasty, but more importantly, with the decline of the Sassanids, we have the end of the classical period, right, and the beginning of the post-classical era. And just a map of a couple of empires. You see the Parthian here in purple, right, and then the final one, the Sassanid, here in orange. And that does it for our talk on politics and political structure of Persia. Our second talk will focus on social structure, economics, and trade, and then also just touch briefly on Zoroastrianism, which was a very significant cultural aspect of life in classical